Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on national television Doordarshan about India's foreign policy, emerging trends in the global environment and how they impact on India's security and rise as a responsible power. This week, viewers, we are looking at a very important aspect of Indian foreign policy, which is how it should apprise the 800-pound dragon up north, which is China. China, of course, is rising at an alarming rate as far as democracies go, and India is no exception to that. Most of us have been watching with concern about China's power and influence, and also the methods that it's been using to try and penetrate democratic societies and influence politics and public opinion within these countries, as also intimidate, threaten, and even coerce democracies to bend to China's will. So this is a number one foreign policy concern for India as well as for many other democracies. And so we are taking up this theme of how democracies are rising up to the challenge of China, and how they could be vulnerable, but how they also have some strengths with which they can push back this Chinese encroachment and pressure. And to discuss this, viewers, I have a very interesting and important guest joining us from Sydney, Australia, Professor Salvatore Babones. Professor Babones is very well-known pundit on international affairs and geopolitics. He is associate professor at the University of Sydney in Australia and has written a number of books, and is also a columnist for foreign policy and an influential voice on the emerging global trends. Professor Babones, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Sydney, Australia.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Professor Babones, when we talk about China, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that, you know, it's expanding and its power has enhanced over the last decade or so. And there is definitely a push factor when it comes to China, the way it is trying to approach its neighbors and the international community at large. You are in Australia, and you've been writing about this aspect for a long time. To begin with, what do you think is the unique threat that a large power like China, which is authoritarian, poses to democracies? And democracies, it's not just a geopolitical challenge, isn't it? Because there are many other aspects by which China is insidiously trying to expand and influence and interfere in our democratic open societies, taking advantage of our openness while it remains closed and blocked to the outside world through its firewalls and many other means of censorship. So how do you think this China threat has evolved in the last few years?
The first thing to understand about China is that it is not, in fact, an authoritarian country. It is a classic textbook definition of a totalitarian country. And that may sound like a fine distinction to people, but in fact, these are two, both bad, but very different governance systems. Russia, for example, is a classic authoritarian country, a non-party quasi-democracy in which a strong man is endorsed by the major institutions of society. China, on the other hand, is a totalitarian regime in which the tentacles of a single dominant political party reach into every aspect of society. There is, in practice, no civil society in China whatsoever. That is, all elements of society are ultimately controlled by the Communist Party and by ultimately a small cabal at the top of the Communist Party of China. That makes China much more dangerous to the rest of the world than a country like, for example, Russia. Russia does pose a potential military threat, as we've seen in the war in Ukraine, but it doesn't pose much of an ideological threat. We don't see countries around the world wanting to embrace a Russian model of governance. We don't see a Russian Belt and Road Initiative trying to sign up other countries. We don't see very effective Russian efforts to undermine democracies in other countries. I mean, as we all know now, the narrative about the 2016 election in the US was all a lot of hot air. There wasn't any serious Russian attempt to undermine American democracy, and there's no serious attempt to undermine other democracies. I don't want to exonerate Russia here. I want to distinguish between the kind of threat Russia is, primarily military, to the kind of threat China is. China does have its tentacles inside democracies around the world. It has, especially in the English-speaking countries, where there's a very large Chinese diaspora, it maintains a strong influence on both the Chinese language media but also on the English language media, which is something, again, that an authoritarian country would have a lot of trouble doing. So China is certainly a threat. It's a military threat, but it's a much bigger threat than authoritarian countries because it is at heart a totalitarian regime.
It's a point well taken, Professor Babones. Yes, it's a totalitarian regime, and you use the word tentacles, and I think that's right, because that's the way it's been spreading. I mean, a lot of malicious interference and influence operations in rich industrialized democracies that we have seen, from the UK, the Europeans, Canada, the US, a lot of them have been unearthing plots involving, Chinese operations to manipulate their politics, their public opinion, and to sow dissent in those societies, to even mold the opinions of influential figures like members of parliament and people in the media, in the academia, in favor of China. And essentially a kind of it's beyond lobbying. I mean, this is a kind of gross interference. And you are in Australia, and they even had to pass laws preventing meddling by foreign powers through these devious means. So why is China doing this?
China is, frankly, attempting to gain political influence in the countries in which it has operations abroad. Those political influence operations are sophisticated, they're state-directed, and they're very well funded. On top of that, Chinese technology platforms pose a further threat. So when India had the confrontation with China a few years ago in Galwan, of course, there was a physical pushback at the border, but probably the more important pushback was to prohibit Chinese platforms from operating in India. TikTok on the phone, or more nefariously, WeChat on the phone, or Alipay as a method of payment. These directly threaten privacy, and through privacy, security in the countries in which these platforms are allowed. On top of that, there's also the more old-fashioned direct forms of simple bribery of elected officials and political parties. And not just those, I mean, institutions more broadly. Universities have been a major target of Chinese influence operations. Because our institutions in the West, and when I say the West, I mean that I probably should not even say the West, I should say in the free world, because I mean to include India and Japan in this, for example. Because our institutions in the free world are generally open institutions, they're very vulnerable to that kind of approach in a way that more closed countries wouldn't be.
Very much so. And on this, viewers, I'd like you to listen into a joint press conference by the heads of the domestic intelligence of the US and the UK, the FBI and the MI5, where they are warning about how China is penetrating their societies and creating trouble in these countries and actually trying to undermine the democratic frameworks of these countries. Let's watch this and continue the discussion.
The heads of the FBI and MI5 appeared together for the first time on Wednesday in London to warn of the threat posed by China. FBI Director Christopher Wray said the government in Beijing was the biggest long-term threat to the US and its allies. He pointed to both economic and national security concerns.
The Chinese government is set on stealing your technology, whatever it is that makes your industry tick, and using it to undercut your business and dominate your market. And they're set on using every tool at their disposal to do it.
Wray also warned businesses against what he said were the practices of the Chinese government, saying it was using every tool in order to steal technologies. MI5 Director General Ken McCallum said they had more than doubled efforts against what he called Chinese activity of concern.
The widespread Western assumption that growing prosperity within China and increasing connectivity with the West would automatically lead to greater political freedom has, I'm afraid, been shown to be plain wrong. But the Chinese Communist Party is interested in our democratic, media and legal systems, not to emulate them, sadly, but to use them for its gain.
Just last week, US lawmakers unveiled a bill to block exports of US personal data to countries like China that they say pose national security risks.
Viewers, you just got a glimpse of the problem the threat that democracies are facing, where the heads of the intelligence of two advanced democracies are warning us that there is a very systematic attempt to infiltrate, to steal data, to steal industrial secrets, to manipulate opinion, and even to impose Chinese viewpoints on free thinking societies. I want to go back to Professor Babones on this. Professor Babones, there is a lot of counterintelligence work going on around the world, and like I said, plots are being unearthed, but it doesn't seem to be deterring the Chinese. They are quite determined to keep on trying to do this, and possibly because we haven't raised the costs enough and actually retaliated against them enough, we meaning democracies, both the advanced democracies as well as leading developing democracies like India. So on this front, what more can be done apart from detecting these operations and neutralizing their effects in our societies, which is a defensive action, but can we jointly also promote more of a focus on human rights problems and atrocities and even genocide which the Chinese are committing on their own soil against minorities? In other words, fight back in a way that raises the cost of this kind of nefarious actions of the Chinese.
There's a lot we can do to convince other countries to join us. And when I say us here, I mean the grand us of the major free world countries that have been pushing back against China. So the United States, Australia, India, Japan have all been pushing back against China. But South Korea less so. Continental Europe and the European Union much less so. Countries in Africa, much less so. Countries in the Muslim world, much less so. They should all be joining us in this because they're all at risk as well. I mean, as we just saw in Sri Lanka and the terrible events of the last few years in Sri Lanka, the China threat is not a threat specifically to the United States or to Australia or to India or to the West or to the free world. It's a threat to everybody. Now, that's something that otherwise neutral countries should be asking themselves, is it worth taking some kind of small Chinese subsidy in order to compromise our integrity? If countries around the world all showed integrity, then China would find very little opportunity to infiltrate our societies. Now, of course, we should be calling out human rights abuses in China. I'd like to see more of that. I've done that myself, and I encourage everyone to do so. But calling people out will only go so far. Ultimately, we have to put our money where our mouth is about that. Are we willing to buy products from companies that engage in such abuses? Are we willing to visit, once coronavirus ends, are we willing to visit a totalitarian country as tourists? I mean, I enjoyed being a tourist in China when China was opening more and more and liberalizing more and more. Now I would be very uncomfortable going to China as a tourist, despite all the amazing tourist sites there are to see in China. So I think we should start treating China like the evil totalitarian country it is.
Absolutely. And on the point about fragile developing countries, Professor Babones, you mentioned Sri Lanka already. There's Pakistan. There are at least 40 countries that have been identified which are in hock to China, with 10% or more of their total public debt held to China. There are some countries where even 40, 50 or more % of their entire foreign debt is held by China. So essentially they are extracting their pound of flesh through those means too. And some of these fragile countries, democracies are shaky, and you can see overthrows of regimes as a result of the ill effects of the Chinese embrace and what we call the debt trap diplomacy. So throughout their extensive Belt and Road initiative, they have created these dependencies, and they're coming home to roost now. And we may see many more dominoes fall the way Sri Lanka happened. People talk about Zambia in Africa. There are a bunch of countries like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan in the Central Asia, and quite a few in Southeast Asia as well, that are highly vulnerable to Chinese debt-fueled collapses. So this is where the onus lies on the more advanced democracies to shore up, I think, the order before the Chinese infiltrate and then surreptitiously take over prime real estate for running their geopolitical agendas.
What those loans represent are corruption. Not every loan, not all the time, but many of them represent corruption. And we saw that in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's problem was not that it couldn't afford to pay China the debt service it owed. Sri Lanka's fundamental problem was that the government in Sri Lanka, or those who ran the government, had become beholden to Chinese money provided on concessional terms. It was fundamentally a corruption situation. Now, I don't think that Western governments or free world governments more broadly are responsible for providing more money because someone else is willing to offer corrupt funding. The funding is there. Now, there's never enough funding for projects in developing countries. That's always a problem. But the Chinese funding is not gone to replace Western money that simply was insufficient. I think that narrative is entirely wrong. The Western money is still flowing, and even some quote-unquote good or clean Chinese money is flowing. For example, from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, all indications are that their loans are relatively clean. But much of the money coming directly from China as subsidies has gone for corrupt purposes. It hasn't gone for development. It hasn't been a lack of Western finance that's resulted in them. It's been the greed of developing country leaders who often see the opportunity to borrow money from China that they never intend to repay as a allowable form of corruption. And the onus is on them.
Yeah. So governance systems are being eroded in other ways. Corruption that is imported from China is weakening the institutions in a lot of these fragile developing countries. Professor Babones, there's also the trade aspect. I mean, China's predatory trade practices have flooded the world markets and have destroyed local industries and created major socioeconomic crises in many countries. And it's only the last few years that democracies have started pushing back and imposing more and more barriers, because earlier, especially the advanced industrialized countries, the OECD countries, were happy to trade with China with the open arms and were enabling China's rise. And now we seem to have at least understood that we've created a Frankenstein, if you like it, and they are grabbing world markets, and their companies destroy local competitors and try to create monopolies. So this aspect is also a major threat, isn't it?
China is not a market economy. Now, the US President Bill Clinton made a determination that China was a market economy now, I think, 23 years ago. It wasn't a market economy then, it's not now. That determination allowed it to get into the World Trade Organization, in effect. China is not a market economy, which means that its businesses are not playing by the same rules as businesses in other countries. That's profoundly unfair for businesses who come up against Chinese state-sponsored competition. It's a real problem because if the Chinese government is willing to milk their own population in order to support a small number of favored oligarchs, those oligarchs can undercut prices in the rest of the world and put other companies out of business. Well, maybe the way out of it should be tariffs, but having led China into the World Trade Organization, now it's very difficult to impose compensating tariffs on Chinese products.
Yeah, so there is a quest for a decentralized globalization where China no longer remains the focal point or the centerpiece around which all the global economic activities revolve. There are also efforts to create resilient supply chains that diversify production and trade networks out of the Chinese ambit. But of course, it's a work in progress. Viewers, China's also been threatening countries directly, especially in the Indo-Pacific and in Asia, through the traditional military means. Its expansionism, its increasing territorial claims on not just India, but a range of countries has really brought the peril home to a lot of countries that believed initially that maybe we'll just have to contend with China's rise in an economic realm only. But no, I think the classic gunboat diplomacy or coercion, military coercion, is very much around. And I'd like you to hear from well-known Indian commentator and writer Gaurie Dwivedi, who's written a book called Blinkers Off, where she's talking about this expansionist mindset of China and Chinese leadership of Xi Jinping and how we should contend with it. Let's listen in.
Xi Jinping is a man who's only competing with history, and he's competing with two dead men, that is Mao Zedong or Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. Both of them had major military achievements and major economic achievements, which are part of their legacy. And Xi Jinping, in his third term, now wants to better that. And the only way he can do, in his mind, is by changing the status quo against China's neighbors in the immediate neighborhood. And that's why it has made those claims, which are not just laughable, but they connect to a larger plan, which is that it wants to change status quo. Now, take for instance the recent events that have unfolded. Now, China has made 5 very laughable claims, but put them together and you will see a strategy of military aggression and massive expansionism at its very core. It made a laughable claim, the Chinese state media, that Mount Everest was actually sitting on Chinese territory. Believe it or not, in May this year, Chinese state media suddenly discovered that Tajikistan's Pamri Mountains were actually part of Chinese territory. It gets better. It also made claims to Bhutan's eastern sector, which has an impact not just on Bhutanese foreign policy, but also has an immediate impact on India's sovereignty. Then it made a claim in Japanese waters that Okinotori, which is the southernmost point of Japan, actually was in China's maritime waters. Now, all these have one objective at its very core, which is that bit by bit keep expanding, keep having the salami slicing of territories, both on land as well as on marine waters, to ensure that the status quo keeps changing, but at the very same time, it doesn't invite a military pushback like the kind Russia invited when it invaded Ukraine. So that is what the objective and the strategy has been for China and for Chinese President Xi Jinping, to expand military activities and expand China's geographies, but at the same time do it tactically in a manner that it doesn't face a concerted pushback from Western countries or from the developed world.
So viewers, you just heard from Gaurie Dwivedi about how China is making quote unquote laughable claims, but it's not a laughing matter, because they are also trying to push those claims using brute force and using their asymmetry in terms of military power vis-a-vis their smaller neighbors. Professor Babones, sitting in Australia, Australia has also woken up to the Chinese threat in last few years and has taken a bold position. The point is that in Asia, when you look at the Indo-Pacific region, the Chinese are building the fastest growing navy with a huge carrier and submarine and missile arsenal, and they are imposing conditions, occupying territories through salami slicing step by step, and even threatening to invade outright and occupy Taiwan. So there are different gradients of Chinese bullying tactics that we are facing in Asia, especially countries like India, which are right next door, which have disputed territorial and maritime boundaries with China. Now, what is the limit to this? And we have formed the Quad now, and there is a talk of a Quad Plus, although that's not taken off yet. Before it gets worse, we need to get our act together and form larger coalitions of like-minded countries, isn't it? The US is there, but the US commitment often is questioned by many in the region, and there are doubts about how much it will come to the rescue of any one of these countries if they are directly attacked by China.
We talk about countries in Southeast Asia not being sure that the U.S. will rescue them or the U.S. will have their back. That's entirely the backwards way to think about it. The question is, does the Philippines care about the South China Sea? Does Malaysia care? Does Indonesia care? If they don't care about it, why should the U.S. intervene to protect it on their behalf? The U.S. is very far away. There's no U.S. strategic interest in these areas, no great strategic interest. Okay, now, the reason the regional countries have not pushed back aggressively is that China is only grabbing areas that have little to no economic value and have no population. India is a nation state there to defending its honor and its territory. Well, in the South China Sea, we've seen countries in the region behaving much more almost like rational companies, saying that why should we fight over this island that in any case is unoccupied and has no population and very little economic value? I guarantee you, if countries in Southeast Asia were aggressively pushing back against Chinese expansionism, they would find very strong US support for their pushback. But if they simply say, we want to have good relations with China, but we'd love it if the United States came in and pushed back on our behalf, well, I doubt they'll get much traction there, any more than if the United States told countries to come fight its wars when it wasn't willing to put up the effort itself.
Yeah, so it takes two to tango, and I think what Professor Babones is saying is that the countries that are directly impacted by Chinese hegemony and expansionism have to also stand up directly, and it's only then when we can get support from extra regional powers or great powers who want to push back China or to contain China. The point is that we can't be wishy-washy about it, and we've got
I'm sorry, when the government of the Philippines is inviting China in, and it has been for the last 3 administrations in the Philippines, saying that the Philippines wants to invite Chinese investment, it's not concerned about Chinese aggression. Well, why should any country, I mean the US or anybody, say we want to defend Filipino islands that the Philippines is not willing to raise a fuss over? That would just be silly.
Absolutely. So I think we have to also realize the threat that we are facing and not be ambivalent about it. I think that's the larger message of this discussion, viewers. The point is that China can grow and expand and threaten us only if we are willing to allow it to be. I think that's the bigger message. And if we get our act together, if we have clarity of national interests and we know what is our number one national security problem in Asia, then I think China cannot march forward like a juggernaut, and only then will we be able to actually push it back as well. I want to thank Professor Babones for his time. Thank you so much for your insights. It's been really valuable.
Thank you.
So viewers, do think about the China threat. I mean, some people call it a bogey, but it's becoming increasingly relevant to all of us, and our lives, our futures are dependent on whether we realize this threat early and stop it before it gets worse. Hillary Clinton, the former US Secretary of State, once said that I don't want my grandchildren to grow up in a world that is dominated by China. I don't think we want our children or grandchildren either to be in a Sinocentric world order. So we've got to stand up to this, and we've got to deal with the menace, all of us, each one of us, and also collectively as democracies. Keep watching Indian Diplomacy, and I'll see you again next time. Take care.